Okay, good morning class, or good afternoon I guess it is really. I hope you're having a good day. And we're concluding today week 14. So next week, at least this semester, as the recording of this, if I would say these things because who knows, my great-great-great-grandchildren may watch this video someday and they'll say, what do you mean you're talking about Thanksgiving break next week? This is the springtime or something. But so I try not to date things too much. But for this, as of the recording here of this lecture, we are on the cusp of Thanksgiving break, which will be all next week. So I hope you can gobble a lot next week. Not that you're turkeys, but eat lots of turkey and enjoy your families and so forth. Okay, so let's see. So we're going to wrap up chapter 16 today and maybe talk a little bit more about wage determination and so forth as it's addressed a little bit at the front part of chapter 17. We'll see how far we get today. But we're talking about factor markets, and so chapter 16 focuses primarily on the market for labor and for capital, and to kind of keep things simple and pretty much real world, because we see a lot of this, we're going to assume, or we have assumed, that we're working with perfectly competitive factor or resource markets. So we're talking again for the market for labor, say, or capital. And by perfectly competitive, we mean that the buyers and the sellers of labor, okay, so their households and firms take an opposite role than they do in product markets. In product markets, households are buyers. You go to Walmart, you buy something, okay, but there's also someone there selling their labor, if you will. So households participate in that instance in what's called a resource or factor market. And so there, in that instance, we're going to assume that factor market is perfectly competitive. Okay, so the buyer and the seller of an hour of labor, okay, whatever the unit of resource is, they are price takers. Okay, that's what it means to be in a perfectly competitive situation. You, as a supplier or buyer for labor, you're competing with lots of other buyers and sellers. So you have no power over the price at which your labor is sold or at which the labor you wish to buy is purchased. Okay, so you have the standard supply and demand curves in that market, that product market, or that factor market that we had in product markets as well. Got supply and demand. Okay, so last time we kind of concluded, we've spent quite a bit of time on this chapter. Okay, I mean this is like the third full day on chapter 17, but we kind of concluded our examination of the demand for a resource, so the demand for labor curve. And there's a couple things that we address as we did in product markets. We looked at determinants of product demand back there early in the course. So here we looked at determinants of factor demand, labor demand. So, these are things that shift the labor demand curve, much like a determinant of product demand shifted the product demand curve. Okay. And then we looked also at the elasticity, the price elasticity of labor demand. We can just say elasticity. There are various elasticities, but we'll talk just when we say elasticity of labor demand, it has to do with something about the slope, for the most part, of the labor demand curve itself. So we're looking at the responsiveness of the quantity demanded of labor with respect to a change in its price. So if wage earners clamor for a 10% increase in a certain market, maybe it's the market for unskilled labor in a certain area, if they all get together somehow, and that wouldn't be perfectly competitive exactly, but suppose, they try to bid up their wage Well, how are employers going to respond to that? Are they going to fire a bunch of workers, okay, or hire fewer workers or not? If they pretty much hire at the same level at a higher wage rate, then we would say that the demand for their labor is very price inelastic, or just inelastic, okay? Because there's not much change in the quantity demanded of their labor in the face of a change in the price of their labor. Because that's what it means to be inelastic. Recall, when we talked about elasticity before, elastic markets and so forth, either the supply or demand side will be inelastic if the quantity supplied or demanded, and we're looking at demand for labor, is pretty inflexible. That's what it means to be inelastic. So if the wages go up and employers continue to hire workers at the same level, we're looking at an inelastic demand situation. All right, so here's what we did. I'm going to go to the document camera here if we can, Radar. And I just wrote this before class, and sorry I don't really have this on a handout, but I'm going to summarize what we've talked about in the last day and a half here with respect to, say, labor demand. You have determinants of labor demand, say a resource demand, just primarily it'll be labor in most cases for us in this course. Determinants are shifters of the labor demand curve. So again, I'll put this back up, but you have a market for labor, just like you have a market for products. You have a price on the vertical axis. This is the price of labor. I'll say P sub L. Another word for that is wage. Okay? And you have a supply and demand curve, S and D. Okay? So we're focusing a lot on the demand for labor. And this is the quantity of that resource that gets traded in the marketplace. So I'll say Q sub L. And so here's a market here. And this is the market for labor. And if you focus on the demand for a second, it's obtained by horizontal summation of individual demand curves facing individual purchasers of labor. You know, individual firms, they purchase labor. Each one has an individual demand for labor, okay? And so when we go from the market, this is the market here, when we go from the market to the individual, we usually use a small d here, okay, and a small q here, but the idea is the same. So now I'm going to go from the market, I'm going to step back and look at the individual demander for labor. And we said that the demand, and so you horizontally sum, of course, across their individual demand curves to get the market demand. This makes sense. It's kind of the same thing we did earlier, so I don't feel like I need to draw a pretty picture on this, but I'm looking now at the individual firm, okay, and so forth. So there's individual firms, and in this case, with respect to the demand for labor, is the marginal revenue product. Okay, we get the individual demand for labor from the marginal revenue product. So we're at the individual level here, and so at any rate, it's this curve right here. And I kind of hated to put the supply curve on here at the moment. I just want to focus on this for an individual firm. The individual firm will demand labor according to the marginal revenue product. Okay? If that makes sense. So there's I think a discussion in your text toward the end of chapter, seems like it's toward the end of the chapter where they do a summation, a horizontal summation. I don't see it here. But of the individual demand for labor curves and to get the market demand. At any rate, the individual demand for labor will shift. And accordingly, the market demand for labor will shift if you change one of these things we call determinants. So what are the determinants? We listed these time before last, and then last time we got into the things that affect labor elasticity. So I'm going to just go ahead and put this right here. Save myself a little writing. Let's back off on this. This is all in your book. I just summarized this. I know it's a lot of writing here. But what are the determinants of resource demand, say labor demand? What things will affect the position of the demand curve? Well, first off, you might have changes in the product demand. All right? So you demand more labor, your firm will demand more labor if more people demand the product that your labor makes. Hope that makes sense. So if you make tables and more people want your table, then you're going to have to demand, you will demand more people who have the skill to make those tables. Whatever it is. Changes in productivity, okay? Change it if your workers are more productive, or if the pool of workers you have to draw from as a firm are more productive, then you're going to demand more of those workers. Hope that makes sense too. So what kind of things would affect the productivity of the workers you have to hire? Okay, well, I mean, changes in productivity could be affected by the quantity of other resources they have to work with. So if there's more capital for your workers to work with, then they're more productive. And if they're more productive, you demand more of them. Okay? So that's going to cause a right shift in this individual demand for labor curve. Technological advances, if the machinery your workers have to work with is more sophisticated, you get a new generation of saws and 3D printers, as we looked at just a moment ago, and so forth, then your workers are more productive, and so you want more of those workers who can operate the more sophisticated machinery. So if there's a technological advance in the machinery workers have to work with, you demand more workers. Or if there's an increase in the quality of the variable resource itself. So if we're talking about the demand for labor, and labor has a higher quality today than it did a generation ago because your workers out there who are available to work are better fed, better educated, and so forth, then you'll have a higher demand for those workers. Hope that makes sense. Okay. Then the changes in prices of other resources. Okay, so you could have substitute resources and complementary resources. Think about that just a second. Sometimes you can substitute machinery for people. You know, your book has a little story. They talk about ATMs. For a while was thought to be a pure substitute for bank tellers. Okay? So, and that would be the case if all bank tellers do is handle deposits and withdrawals, cash transactions. If that's all that bank tellers were confined to do, well, heck, you can replace bank tellers with a machine called ATM, right? And so there you would have a substitute resource. And generally speaking, there's two competing things going on here, two competing effects when you're talking about a substitute resource. If the price of ATM machines goes down, then the substitution effect would say that you're inclined as a bank, as an employer, to hire fewer bank tellers, right? Price of ATM machines go down, you can buy more of them, fire a bunch of tellers, okay? That is the substitution effect. However, if the price of ATMs goes down markedly, okay, then it could be that a bank finds it profitable to open a new branch, okay, and to serve more customers. And if that's the case, they may want more bank tellers, okay? So that's called the output effect. So you have these two competing effects, if you will, that operate on substitute resources. ATM machines are a substitute for bank tellers in that instance, okay? So when the price of the ATM goes down, it may be that you want to hire fewer or more bank tellers, depending on which of these dominate. If the substitution effect dominates, then you'll fire bank workers or bank tellers. Okay, you hire fewer of them. But if the output effect dominates, so it becomes more profitable for a bank to service more customers because the ATM machine's cheaper, then they'll hire more. They'll hire more bank tellers. So that's the output effect. So when you're talking about substitute resources like this, there's two competing effects that you have to weigh against each other to get what's called the net effect. Okay, so we've looked at that. And then there are complementary resources. Okay, these are resources used in fixed proportions. I keep using truck driver and trucks. Right now they're complementary resources. If you're going to have an 18-wheeler, for the most part, I guess there are a few maybe already are driverless, right? That's a scary thought. But up until the modern era, it had to be the case that if you have a truck, you got to have a driver. Maybe you have to have two drivers. If you want to keep that truck on the road 24 hours a day, you have to have a team of drivers or something like that. So it could be you have to have two, or maybe even if it's an airplane, or you're talking about a freight airplane, it flies for UPS or something like that, you have to have three people sitting in the cockpit. You might have to have a pilot, a co-pilot, and a navigator, something like that. That would be kind of an extreme case, but you'd have fixed proportions. For each airplane, you got to have three pilots, or equally qualified people to fly the airplane or something. So in that case, you have complementary resources. So let's think about trucks for a second. It's just kind of say one truck and one driver. That's the fixed proportion, 1-to-1. If the price of trucks goes down, then lots of companies will use more trucks. Okay, I might even get in the truck. I've thought about getting in the trucking business. Never raked up the capital before, but somebody else might put some trucks on the road. But oh yeah, that's going to affect. I got to have some drivers. Okay, so that would increase the demand for labor. Those are determinants. Okay, so I have those listed here on the left. Those are things that affect the position of this marginal revenue product curve, which is the demand for labor or any resource curve. So it'll shift it left and right in that framework we were looking at. Okay, now then we moved from determinants of labor demand to elasticity of labor demand. Now with elasticity, we're simply looking at how the quantity demanded for labor responds to a change in the price of labor, not the price of some of these other things necessarily, substitutes and complements and so forth. We're purely looking at labor, and we're asking ourselves how responsive is the quantity demanded of labor to the price of labor. So remember we had this formula basically we always use when we talk about elasticity. We wrote E R sub D is the percent change in the quantity demanded of the resource divided by percent change in the price of the resource. Now what things would affect that? Okay. Whoops, I'm sorry. I can't see the screen and write at the same time. So I have these three things listed as they are listed in your text. Okay. These affect the elasticity of labor demand. The ease of resource substitutability. Can you substitute your workers with something else easily? Okay. Got two competing resources. If you can, that makes, if it's easy to substitute something else for workers, some machine or what have you, that'll affect the elasticity of resource demand. The elasticity of the product your labor makes in the product market, product demand. So we drew this picture last time, recall, where we looked at how the quantity demanded of a product is affected by a shift in the supply of the product that's made by your workers. If the product demand is very elastic, then a small increase, well, I think we use there a small decrease in the price of labor would cause a shift in the supply of the product in the product market and come back to the resource or labor market with a big change in the quantity demanded of labor. So if the product is elastic, the resource is elastic. That's the easy way to remember. But go back and look at how we drew that out if you need to. And then if the resource cost is a big proportion of the total cost of the product itself, then the demand for that resource is elastic. So if something, say, is labor intensive, takes a lot of labor to make something carved out of wood, okay? Now, if that's the case, then, so the ratio of the resource cost in that case would probably be a high proportion of the total cost of the output. Okay, so that would affect the elasticity of labor resource demand. Okay, so when the ratio of the resource cost is small, look for the elasticity of labor demand to be small as well. Okay, it's kind of like what we had with product markets. You know, we kept saying table salt is a small proportion of your total expenditures through the course of a year. If the price of table salt goes up, if it doubles, you're still going to buy table salt. Same thing if it takes just a little bit of labor to make something, so the price of labor goes up to make that thing significantly, you're still going to purchase the labor. Okay? So as long as there's a little bit of labor to make something, the elasticity of labor demand is small. Okay, so that is kind of the summary of the determinants of resource demand and the elasticity as they talk about in your text. And so we're going to wrap up today talking about the optimal combinations of resources. What's the optimal combinations of labor and capital you would put together to make whatever? I'm thinking primarily in a manufacturing situation. So we make furniture, okay? How many units of capital and how many units of labor would you use to fulfill a contract making lab tables for a university or something like that? Well, okay, so first off, there's this thing your book talks about. So I'm going to go to the document camera here, radar. We'll talk about here optimal combinations of resources. Okay, first off, there's this thing called the least cost rule. Sorry about that. Least cost rule. Basically, for any level of output, so you want to make however many lab tables. I like to use that example. It's got a slate table, tabletop, and wooden legs and so forth. You want to deliver 100 of these to Rogers State University for the chemistry lab or what have you. Whatever the level of output is, then you can produce that at least cost when the marginal product of labor over the price of labor is equal to the marginal product of capital over the price of capital. That is to say, you want to spend the last dollar on each resource that yields the same marginal product. The last dollar spent in manufacturing 100 tables for RSU, you'd want that last dollar to provide the same marginal product, whether it's spent on labor or capital. So there's different ways to make tables. You don't have to have machines. Perhaps have a bunch of people. Or you maybe can do it all with machines and very few people. The least cost combination is determined by this rule right here. And I hope this maybe looks familiar to you. We use something called the rational spending rule when we talked about the what's the most you could get out of spending $50 a week, and we had apples and oranges, and we equated marginal utility to product price. It's kind of a rule similar to that. But here we get the least cost combination of labor and capital when we combine them so that the last dollar spent on each provides the same marginal product. So the marginal product of labor to price of labor equals the marginal product of capital to the price of capital. So here's the question. So if the last dollar spent on labor has a higher marginal product than the last dollar spent on capital, then what did the manufacturer do wrong here? The manufacturer is not producing tables at its least cost, in the least cost combination. They're either hiring too much labor and not enough capital, or too much capital, not enough labor. So if this is not satisfied, then an improvement could be made. So maybe next year you got to make another 100 tables for another university. Let's see if we can produce that 100 tables next year, next week, whatever it is, at a smaller cost. You certainly want to do that. The least cost rule says you need to satisfy this thing. And if you got this temporarily, there's some adjustment in order. So my question here is, what should we do? You're going to hire labor and you're going to hire capital. You're going to rent machines and you're going to rent bodies. So the question is, I guess I could have put my blanks here, but do we want more capital and less labor, or do we want more labor and less capital? Hint, okay? The hint is this. You have something again called the diminishing marginal product. We've looked at this before, diminishing marginal product of labor and capital. So you got this for both resource, something called diminishing marginal product. We've looked at this in the manufacturing environment before. When you started hiring workers, recall in the little factory that makes baseball bats. You had 4 workers, then we hired a 5th one. At some point, the marginal product goes down. That's an inevitable fact in manufacturing. That's the environment we'll think about here. In the short run, certainly, is that as you hire more of one resource, at some point the marginal product has to go down. Now, again, we're hearkening back to something, I don't even remember what chapter that is. It was a chapter on production. Let me see, because this is something I want to make sure we know. I think it was chapter 8. No, it's chapter 9. And we sketched this, we sketched the total product curve here. And at some point, you know, you increase at a decreasing rate in output as you hire more workers, okay? So that's all I'm alluding to. The same is true for capital. If you hold labor fixed and you increase units of capital, so you don't hire more people, but you hire more machines, either case, in the short run, you're going to witness this for a variable input. Okay, so here's my question again, because this is the hint. Okay, if this is the case, how should you reallocate your spending on labor and capital? Should you buy more labor and less capital, more capital and less labor? What do y'all think, class, if this is the case? Given that you have diminishing marginal product of labor and capital. Let's use K for capital. Well, you got to drive this down, right? You want to drive this up. So the only way you can drive this down in a perfectly competitive environment, first off, you got to accept the wage, the price of labor, and the price of capital is fixed. It's like, you know, you're an employer, you have no power over the wage. That's, again, the situation we're considering here. Perfectly competitive labor markets. Just like when you go to the grocery store, you have no bargaining power over a pound of apples. You don't haggle with the cashier over apples. Employers can't haggle over the wage here. That, again, is kind of the assumption here and what we're looking at. So you do, though, as an employer, have power over the numerator. So you want to drive this numerator down and this one up. The only way you can drive this down, if there's diminishing marginal product of labor, is you want to hire more labor, right? And you want to drive this one up, so you'd hire less capital. So if you spent $10,000 on resources to make those tables last year or last week, those 100 tables, you spent $10,000. Guess what? You'd be better off if you hired more workers and less capital, and you'll be able to make the same output level at a cheaper cost. And of course, if you're in business, that's what you want to do, right? So this is a very practical rule. You know, there's ways of measuring these marginal products and so forth from data that you might have, from workplace data, so forth. But if you have a situation like this, Then the smart manager would say, hey, let's back off on capital, fewer machines, let's hire more bodies. We're going to be able to fill that order at a cheaper cost. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so this is called the least cost rule. Very important thing. You didn't think of it. It's bang per buck. Remember we use that term in product markets. Now we're using it in resource markets. Now, it doesn't answer this question though. It doesn't answer the question, what level of output? Well, how many tables should we make in a week or in a month? Given the price of labor and capital, these things are given. How many tables should we make to maximize profit? It doesn't answer that question. It only tells us what is the least cost combination to produce a particular output. But this does not tell us the particular output that will maximize profit. So this, though, is useful, and even more useful, I think, rule is the next rule they give you in your text called the profit maximizing rule. So there's two rules here that deal with the optimal combination of resources. So this is the second rule we want to look at here today, called the profit maximizing rule. Okay? The profit maximizing rule. All right, this will tell you what level of output you need to produce and at what combinations of the resources you want to bring together to maximize profit. And again, we're in a competitive situation and so forth. And we derived this last time. We said you want to hire labor and capital so that the marginal revenue product of labor over the price of labor equals the marginal revenue product of capital. I guess I'll use a C, your book does, over the price of capital. So hire labor and capital until this relationship here is satisfied. And not only that, but it's set equal to 1. Equal to 1. Okay, so I need to have that in the box as well. So if I just had that, this is going to be similar to this expression here. But what I mean when I say this has got to equal to 1 is that the numerator equals the denominator in each of these fractions. So this implies the following. This implies that we're going to hire labor until its marginal revenue product equals the price of labor. Of course, an employer has no control over that. But they do have control over this. As you hire more workers, we've seen the marginal revenue product of labor goes down. Remember, it's filling those tables out. And the marginal revenue product of capital would equal the price of capital. Okay, so if these fractions are equal to 1, so I really want to put that over here, then the numerator equals the denominator. So we've drawn this graph before, back just a moment ago where I had at any rate, I had this little thing here where I talked about the individual demand for labor is the marginal revenue product. Okay, so this is the price of labor and this is the quantity. I'm going to use a small q here. Quantity of labor, Q sub L. And here's a firm. Wherever the wage is, the firm is a price taker in this market. PL. Again, that's determined by the intersection of a supply and demand curve in the market. Okay? So a while ago, I want to make sure I'm careful on this just a second, because when I went from the market to the individual curve, I scratched this thing off here. Okay? Scratch that off. I just want to, for the individual firm, we looked at the marginal revenue product curve as being the individual demand for labor curve. And that's what I have sketched here. This other thing here is the marginal resource cost, the cost of each resource. It's also the price of labor determined by the intersection of the supply and demand curve in the labor market. Okay, so it's the firm wants to hire wants to hire workers until the marginal revenue product falls to the price of labor. In other words, you want to satisfy this thing right here. The first few units have a marginal revenue product greater than the wage rate that you'll have to pay. So you want to hire those workers. But you'll stop hiring when the marginal revenue product has fallen to the wage rate. Okay? So we've looked at this. Okay, there's really nothing new here. I don't know if I have my picture I drew last time, but again, it's in your text. We looked at this situation where we asked ourselves, how many workers, okay, how many workers would we hire for this employer? How many would it hire if the wage rate were $9 an hour? Okay, so we calculated in this last column the marginal revenue product, and we went down here, and you stop when you get to a marginal revenue product equal to the wage rate. So you'd hire the third worker, but not the fourth worker. Okay? So, and this is kind of what we see graphed again here in this picture I alluded to last time. This downward sloping marginal revenue product curve. You continue to hire labor until it falls to the wage rate. Okay? The wage rate, again, is established over here in the market for labor. So this is the individual firm will hire until the marginal revenue product falls to the price of labor set in the marketplace. You're going to do that not only for labor, you're going to do that for capital. Okay, so this is the profit maximizing rule. Okay, now, I brought in a little thing. Basically, it's a chart from table 16.7 in your text, and I'm going to pass this out. And we'll use both of these rules here to answer a couple of questions, okay? So this is for a firm, and let me give you 3 of these, okay? Okay, so we're going to ask ourselves, given some inputs here, how many units of capital, machines, how many workers, units of labor, should this firm hire? Okay, well, it depends on what you want to do, okay? So I'm going to look at the question A. This is basically table 17 I said 17.6. It's 16.7 on page 334 of your text. Oh, yeah, I also mentioned there's a mistake in your book here. This should be a 1 here, okay? Okay, that last thing there should be a 1. So I'll put it here on the table here. So here, for class discussion, I'll say here, I put that 1 right here. Marginal product of the 7th machine is 1 unit. Okay, because the total product goes from 37 to 38. Okay, there's 2 questions they ask you in your text. Okay, first thing is, if you want to produce 50 units of output. Okay, so I think I got some extras here. So here's the question. To produce output equal to 50 units. Maybe they're making lab tables. Okay? Real world question. How many machines and workers should you hire? How many units of each, capital and labor, should we hire? Is that a real world question? That's the only, I mean, you know, this is not just an exercise in making life difficult. We got a fixed output here, and, you know, we got to deliver on a contract, 50 lab tables, whatever it is. And we want to know how many machines, how many people will do that for us at least cost. And that's this principle we just looked at here, the least cost rule. So you're going to want to satisfy an equality here. You're always going to strive toward having an equality between the ratio of the marginal product to the price of each resource. All right? So they do this for you in your text, if you will. But let me just say that here's your marginal product column, and the price of the output. Is it the price of the output or the price of the resource? It's the price of the resource is given here. So make sure you use the right price here as your denominator, and you simply take the ratio of marginal product to the price. So here's the prices you work with. The price of a worker is $8, $8 an hour. You rent a machine at $12 an hour, and here are your marginal products. Okay, so you've got to produce 50 units, all right? So how many of each of these workers should you hire? First off, this is data. You know, you could historically get this data from past experience. You saw that when you had one worker, maybe there's 12 tables they could make, 2 workers, 22, and so forth. And you know the price of the output, your lab tables. Those are pretty cheap lab tables. But you also have the price for your inputs, your workers, and your capital. So to produce 50 units, 50 lab tables, what are you going to hire first? Are you going to hire labor or are you going to hire capital? Well, you come down here and you take 12 over 8. That would be the marginal product over the price of one worker. Or you look at 13 over 12. Okay? So which fraction is the largest? You always go for that, okay? You want the largest bang per buck. So first off, the first dollars you spent on resources should go to what? Labor or capital? What do y'all think, class? Labor. Okay, very good. You get more bang per buck over those first few dollars, okay? You're just peeling off those dollar bills. So the first few. So we're going to hire one worker. Total product is 12, okay? So at one worker comes at $8, but that's the thing is we could find the total cost here in a minute, but you're going to have produced 12 tables. Now, how about the next few dollars you had to spend? Would you spend it on labor, which will have a marginal product per cost of labor of 10 over 8, or would you hire the first unit of capital, which would have a ratio of marginal product to the price of capital of 13 over 12? What do you think now? Would you hire the second worker or the first machine next? Okay, yes, the second worker, right? Boom. 10 over 8 is bigger than 13 over 12. Now, at this point, you are making 12 plus 22, which is 34 tables. Okay? So you're always striving for that. Now, yes, do I hire the third worker or the first machine? Well, the third worker provides an MP over P equal to 6 over 8. That's less than what the first machine would provide. 13 units of marginal product for $12. You get more bang per buck now if you hire 1 unit of machinery, which would provide you with 13 units of output. So what are we producing so far? With 2 workers, you have, whoops, I checked the wrong one. Total product here is 12 plus 22, which is 34. And then over here, you're in 47, okay? So that would be your total product here with hiring 1 more machine. Okay, so so you would continue to do this till you get 50 units. Total product here would be 22. I miscounted there, so the marginal product is 12 and 10, but with two workers, you're now at 22 units of output, and you got 13 units over here. 22 and 13, I guess, is 35, right? So my question now is, would you hire another person, or would you rent a machine? What do you think, class? Would you hire another person, or would you rent a machine? You want to get up to a total product of 50 units. So you could get up to 28 over here if you hired this worker here. So this would be 6 over 8, but you'd get up to 22 over here if you hire the second unit of capital. And the ratio of the marginal product to the price here is 9 over 12. Now 9 over 12 is 3/4 and 6 over 8 is 3/4. So it looks to me like it's an even split between hiring 2 units of capital and 3 units of labor. If you hire 3 workers, you will have produced 28 tables. If you hire 2 units of capital or 2 machines, you'll have 22 tables, whatever this is. And if you add 28 and 22 together, guess what? You get 50. So see how the total output here of 50 tables can be achieved, for one thing, if you hire 3 workers and 2 machines. And so the contention here is there's other ways of producing 50 tables, but this is the least costly way. Okay, you could compute the cost if you want. Let's see what the total cost here is. So let's use 3 laborers and 2 machines. Okay, to produce 28, it's over here, plus 22, which is over here, equals 50 tables. I want to use tables, whatever it is. So we achieved the objective. What's the total cost? So at a total cost of, well, you can get the total cost here by taking the price of each of these. So the price of labor is $8, and you're going to hire 3 workers. So this is $8 per worker times 3 workers. That's the price of labor. Total cost of labor, the price of labor is $8. And the price of capital is $12, and you want 2 units of capital. So this would be $24 plus 24, which is $48. Okay? So at a total cost of $48, you'll produce 50 tables if you use 3 workers and 2 machines. Now there are other ways of producing 50 tables. You could do it all by using labor if you want. You could go down this list. Now notice you only produce 42 if you hire 7 workers and no machines. Okay, you're not even producing the output yet. But I'll tell you what, 7 workers is going to cost you at $8 a piece. 7 times 8 is $56. It's going to cost you more to simply employ workers to make a fewer number of tables. 7 workers, $8 a piece is $56. $56 would produce 42 tables. I think this is better. Spend $48 to make 50 tables. So it's a smaller cost, more tables. Okay? Hope that makes sense. So you're always, like we did before early in the course with the bang per buck rule, you're always striving to get the higher bang per buck as you expend money on labor and capital. This ratio of marginal product to price, whichever one of these is the greatest, will determine what you do with the next dollars you spend. So if this fraction is the largest, you spend more on this. And that's what governed our stepping through this table here. You always purchased one more unit of the resource that had a higher ratio of marginal product to price of that resource. So you do that until you've fulfilled the contract. That is, you've made 50 tables. Now, here's the deal. For these prices, for labor and capital, we have just now determined the least cost combination of labor and capital to produce 50 tables. However, a more interesting question may be this: how many tables should we make to maximize profit? Might make more than 50, okay? I mean, 50 tables, we found an efficient way to do that here, but maybe you want to produce 100 tables to maximize profit. So that's where you use the second rule that we derived here. You hire workers and capital until the marginal revenue products fall to the price. okay, till these ratios here are equal to 1. When this falls to this, that ratio is equal to 1, and so is this ratio. And that's an even easier question, I think, to answer in this table right here. Okay? You hire each resource up to the point where the marginal revenue product falls to the price. Now, so you look here, and you hire all the way to this point. The marginal revenue product equals the price of labor when you've hired 5 workers. How about over here? If the price of capital is $12 a machine, you hire machines until the marginal revenue product falls to the price of a machine. That is, you want 3 machines. Okay? All right? So this is a more powerful result, if you will. This is telling you if you're smart and you're in a competitive market, both product and resource market, so you can sell all the tables you can make. That's the idea. You don't just have a contract with one university. You can make lab tables and sell them all day long. It's a perfectly competitive product market. Then the smart manager would do this. The smart manager will hire capital and labor until their marginal revenue products fall to their price. So you want here 5 laborers and 3 machines. Oh, by the way, what would your total output be? Well, there's 37 tables you'd be making over here, and there's 28 here. Okay? All right. But the idea here, again, is you hire these until the marginal revenue product equals the product price. There's some more complexities here when we look at this and so forth. But we can answer the question. To maximize profit, do y'all want another one of these sheets here? I think I have a couple. To maximize profit, you would hire 5 laborers and 3 machines, or units of capital. Okay, so they, I think, show you this result in your text on page 334. Step through this. Make sure you understand what's going on here, and that's why they've shaded these 2 numbers right here in this chart. Okay. Okay, so is that a practical question? That's a real-world question, right? To maximize profit. Presumably in a capitalistic society, that's what everybody wants to do, is maximize profit. Now this is, again, the theory behind the graph on page 344. Just want you to be familiar with this. Every firm should continue to hire labor until the marginal revenue product falls to the price of labor, which is set in a market for labor that's beyond their control, the firm's control. All right. Okay, so I keep saying that, I hope that makes sense. Spend a little time with that. So that leads us to something in your book they call the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. Marginal productivity theory of income distribution. Here's the statement of it right here. It's a hypothesis, if you will. Now, we're looking at free markets here, so forth. We're going to look at some things that can mess this up. But it's a hypothesis that the wage rate paid to labor will tend to equal the marginal revenue product of labor. In other words, these 2 curves intersect. And this is where employers are going to pay this amount by hiring workers up to the level, hiring the quantity of labor up to the level at which the marginal revenue product equals the wage. So workers are going to earn their marginal revenue product. Okay, that's all that's saying. And this is called the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. So if you want a high wage, you need to be able to deliver for your employer a high marginal revenue product. Okay, and we've seen what affects the marginal revenue product. the quality of labor, are you educated or not, the amount of machinery a worker has to work with, combinations of other resources, and so forth. So they talk about some things here on page 335 of your text, and I would read this if I were you, but we got a little extra time here today, and so this is a, how shall I say, kind of a, this marginal productivity theory of income distribution is something that'll set well with you if you believe that everybody should be paid according to the value you create. All right? That's kind of a hallmark, if you will, of a free market system. If you can create a lot of value, you should be paid a high wage. And I think probably within a certain range, we all agree with that. However, we see certain individuals get astronomically high salaries and wages, and you wonder, are they really creating that much value? Okay, a CEO for a company may be bid away by another company with a promise of a multi-million-dollar contract. Well, generally speaking, the only reason another firm would hire that person away is if indeed that person, that CEO, could deliver, could increase the marginal revenue by more than the price of their services. So, I mean, that's usually the case. So if you think the world ought to operate that way, then what we're observing here with this little diagram is that workers tend to earn their marginal revenue product. That's just fine. But some people, okay, don't have the ability to create much value. Your book talks about that a little bit. Down here somewhere, it says, it talks about that some people may not be able to participate in production at all because of mental or physical disabilities. And they would obtain no income under a system of distribution based solely on the marginal revenue product or marginal productivity. So if you can't produce, you don't earn anything. Now, obviously, our society doesn't work that way. Our society doesn't believe things should work that way. Our system doesn't work that way. There are people who can't work who still get transfer payments through the government and so forth. So we still provide an income for folks who do not, how shall I say, create economic value. Okay, they may create value, but not economic value. Okay? So, but kind of, this is, I think, a very important paragraph, and I think it's something that speaks to the merits of a free market resource system, a system of free resource markets, which would operate the way we're talking about here. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Should the government come in and correct things from time to time? Well, maybe you think it should, if there's inequality at work. And that is, not everybody can live on the economic value they create. Some people get more than they should, others get less than they should. So it says here, critics argue that the distribution of income resulting from payment according to the marginal productivity may be highly unequal because productive resources are very unequally distributed in the first place. And this is going to bring out some things we've talked about. Aside from their differences in mental and physical attributes, individuals encounter substantially different opportunities to enhance their productivity through education and training and the use of more and better equipment. Now, you may not have a physical or mental challenge to overcome to create economic value in the workplace, but alas, you never had the opportunity to go to college, okay, or to get a certain training. Now, we take a college education almost for granted in this day and age, but my grandparents, a couple of them finished high school. 2 of them didn't, 2 of them did. High school education was pretty hard to attain back in the day. I remember my own dad finishing his bachelor's degree. He was in his 30s. I remember it quite well. He had to work real hard to do that, but it was not something at his fingertips. It's not as accessible as it is today. So you may be disadvantaged not because of any particular physical or mental challenges, but because of accessibility to education and training. And that disadvantage will cause for you less opportunity to earn a wage, or at least a satisfying wage. Some people, it says, may not be able to participate at all because, again, of mental or physical disabilities. They would obtain no income because they don't create any economic value. All right? Ownership of property resources is also highly unequal. Many owners of land and capital resources obtain their property by inheritance rather than through their own productive effort. Hence, income from inherited property conflicts with the maxim, if you will, to each according to the value of what they create idea. Okay? So, some people are born with a silver spoon in their mouth. I don't want to get too political here, but it's easy. Now, I love the man, but I'm just going to say this. It might be a little easier for you to build skyscrapers in Manhattan if you were born into a family that was already had the resources and also, was accustomed to leading major construction projects and so forth. So, at any rate, so we look at Trump Tower, okay? He was not the first generation of wealthy people in his family. He was not the first generation, okay? I think that's well known, okay? So, I'm just saying, some people inherit abilities or inherit advantages that others don't. So that would fly in the face, you'd think, to this maxim that we should distribute income according to the value that people create. Some people just don't have the opportunity to create economic value because they didn't start off in life with these advantages. Critics say that these inequalities call for progressive taxation and government spending programs aimed at creating a more equitable income distribution. So if this diagram over here that we keep alluding to, if this is what determines your wage, it's determined by the value, the marginal revenue product you provide to your employer. If that's the only way we distributed income in our culture or our society today, maybe that makes sense. Maybe that's in one way, if you don't create the value, you shouldn't. There's an argument to say then you shouldn't receive a salary or a wage, but be prepared that you're going to have some people in society who will not have an income, and others who will have an astronomical income. So that's the rationale behind our tax code being structured the way it is. It's a progressive tax code, right? The higher your income, the higher the rate you pay on a marginal dollar of income. Let's say $1 of income. The last dollar you earned, you pay taxes out of that at a higher rate when you earn more dollars. Okay, thank you. Y'all understand the tax code, the tax rates, right? So you have these different thresholds, right? So everybody's taxed at the same rate at a low income, but if you step up into the next income, then that additional income that you earn is going to be taxed at a higher rate. So we have progressive marginal tax rates. And of course that leads to higher or progressive average tax rates because the marginal pulls the average in its direction. We've looked at that before as well. Okay, other thing too, this might also, just to wrap this up here, okay, this also might fly in the face of this philosophy that people should be paid according to their marginal revenue product. First off, there are market imperfections in the market for labor and capital. We've been assuming these are competitive, but not all labor markets are competitive. In some labor markets, employers exert their wage-setting power to pay less than competitive wages. If you're the only employer of coal miners in town, or in the whole region, the whole eastern part of Kentucky or what have you, you're the only employer, guess what? You got a lot of leverage to keep those wages you pay down. That's all that's saying. Some workers have leverage through labor unions and so forth, and they can command a higher wage or salary than what they otherwise would. So some workers through labor unions, professional associations, and occupational licensing laws wield wage-setting power in setting their services. So I just learned here recently that, and I haven't been teaching accounting now for a little while, but now they've lowered the bar to get the CPA designation in Oklahoma. Have y'all aware of that? Instead of 30 upper divisional hours in accounting, you only need 24. Well, why did they do that? Well, obviously there's not enough accountants, right? And not enough CPAs. So they've moved this bar up and down. The State Accounting Association has moved the bar up, actually to a point where just recently you had to have 150 hours of college credit. And it didn't matter those 30 hours above your bachelor's degree. It didn't matter what it was in. Okay, I guess it could be an underwater basket weaving. Believe it or not, you just had to have 150 credit hours. That was one requirement to set for the CPA. Now you think about what an artificial designation, a requirement that is. Oh, you got to have 150 hours. Well, why was it set at 150 hours? It's because they want to keep people out of the profession, right? So you have a club there and you want to keep people out, you raise the bar. Now there's a shortage of accountants, CPAs, so we got to lower the bar. There was a time, and it's been since World War II, you didn't have to have a bachelor's degree to set for the CPA. And I don't know if you have to in every state right now or not. You had to go pass the test. You had to know some things, but there's still an argument as to why would you have to have a full bachelor's degree? And this is anathema here to my colleagues, probably because I'm an educrat myself. I'm a creature of this environment. I want you to go to college. College is great, but it's a legitimate question. Do you really need a bachelor's degree to do some of these things that we hire in our culture today? And I would say to be an accountant, just to be honest. Now I might get in trouble for saying that, but to be a good accountant, do I need to know much about art history? Well, to be a good citizen perhaps, but does an accountant need an art history class any more than a steel worker? Oh, yeah, I'm kind of shaking my head that way too. All right. But if you're part of the club, you want to keep people out of the club, then you raise the bar. This is one of those market imperfections they're talking about. You have discrimination. You always have discrimination. Some people have a harder time getting a job because of a physical characteristic or something like that. It has really nothing to do with their ability to do the job, to complete the task the employer may put in front of them. In short, because of real-world market imperfections, it says here, wage rates and other resource prices are not always based solely on contributions to output. Okay, so I hope that helps a little bit here. And we got just 4 minutes. Why don't we look, just to make sure we got this down, look at problem 3, if you will, at the end of the chapter 16. I know we're all wanting to go on break, but we got a little time left here. Gosh, she says 5 minutes. All right, so why don't we look at problem number 3, which is our discussion question 3, and talk about the distinction between determinants and elasticity of labor demand. What factors determine the elasticity of resource demand, it says? What effect will each of the following have on the elasticity or the location of the demand for a resource? So this is basically what they're going to ask us here. They want us to look at these things in turn and ask if these things affect the position of the demand for labor curve or the elasticity of the demand for labor curve. Does that make sense? So an increase in the demand for the product of labor, would that affect the demand for labor or the would that affect the demand for labor or would that affect the elasticity of demand for labor? So when I say affect the demand for labor, the position of the labor demand curve. So if there's an increase in the demand for cell phones, okay? Then you got people who assemble cell phones, okay? That's going to affect one of two things. Either the demand for cell phone assemblers, that's a shift in the demand curve, or the elasticity of cell phone workers, that's the price elasticity. That would be kind of related to the slope, if you will, of the labor demand curve. So what do you think here? If you had an increase in the demand for a good, say cell phones, will that increase the elasticity of demand for laborers, or simply the demand for laborers? Those are two different things, right? Well, okay, well, here you go. You go back, and these are the things, I wrote these down a while ago on that chart. That's where we started off. I won't be able to find it now. But you go back to your book here. We're talking here about how does the demand for the product affect the resource. So this is the first of the determinants they list on page 326. Okay? Whoops, sorry about that. So that's a determinant. If there's a change in the product demand, that's going to shift the demand curve. That's a determinant of the demand for cell phone assemblers. Okay. Number B here, looks like I got like a minute and a half. If there's an increase in the price of a substitute resource, increase in the price of robots, so how's that going to affect the demand or elasticity of demand for cell phone assemblers? Would it affect one of those? So you're talking about the price of a substitute resource. And we got into that, see all my writing in my book, but we got into that on page 328, changes in the prices of other resources. Those affect the position of the labor demand curve, the demand for cell phone assemblers. So again, that's a determinant, okay? That's a determinant. I think we got time here to work one more. Did our video go out? It went out back there. Oh, okay. All right. Well, I think we're all away. I want to do the next one because it's different, but I don't know. Let's do it real quick. An increase in the number of resources substitutable for labor in producing X. Okay, there you're getting into elasticity. Okay, I guess we're having trouble with it. Okay, 30 seconds. Okay, I'll let you finish these. I may post solutions to these here for you guys to consider on that discussion question number 3. At any rate, I hope you have a good break. I'm ready for a break and for a little sleep myself. So I taught last night, so it was kind of hard to come into work today. Y'all have a good evening, good day.